It is a real pleasure to be back here at the Drucker Forum. Last time I was here, I was with Nick's colleague, Roger Lowenstein of the New York Times, talking about the end of Wall Street. And I think we have seen in the months since that there's no end of Wall Street at this point. Don't know what's going on with the Dow, but it's very interesting to watch these days. I want to start by telling you all that Nick and I are friends. At least that's what Facebook says as of yesterday afternoon. I know many things about him, including, of course, that he is the author of this book, and that when he was a kid, his friends' parents thought he was a punk.
It's true.
It's true, yes.
It's true.
Now, your title is I Live in the Future, but with your indulgence, I thought I'd start with a couple of bits from an opinion piece that was recently written by Douglas Coupland. It's a dictionary of the near future, where he helps us with some new terminology. And a couple of examples here. De-selfing, willingly diluting one's sense of self and ego by plastering the internet with as much information as possible. Franken-time, what time feels like when you realize that most of your life is spent working with and around a computer and the internet. And finally, omniscience fatigue, the burnout that comes with being able to know the answer to almost anything online. Now, I must admit to all of you and to Nick that I only joined Facebook about 2 months ago. So I am still getting used to the whole social media world. I have tweeted exactly once.
I bet it was a great tweet, though, right?
Oh, it was awesome.
Yeah.
I don't remember what it was, but I am, however, now reading my books on an iPad.
There you go.
So I am either the best person to talk to you or possibly the worst. You live the future. I live in 2009. So let's talk a little bit. Ted mentioned that he wanted to hear how you got to this particular position at the New York Times, and it's a great, great story. So tell us a little bit about where you started and where you've ended up.
So I have ADD and have done a little bit of everything over the past 15, 20 years. And I started out as actually I was in design school because I actually wanted to be a fine artist, but I realized that you couldn't make a living doing that. So I went into design, and then I actually designed the very first Britney Spears doll, which I'm not very proud of, but
you should be.
But that was, well, I didn't know who she was at the time. You know, somebody just hired me to do this project. But then I went into the film industry and then did some documentary film stuff, and then eventually ended up in journalism. But when I started at the Times about 7 years ago, I started out as an art director, and then I went into the research and development labs. And in the research labs, the goal was really to look 2 to 10 years out. And so we didn't sit there with crystal balls. We actually built prototypes of what we thought the future may look like. And so we got access to like flexible displays that E-Ink was making, and we tried to figure out when those would be in the marketplace. We built customized living rooms. So we actually built this living room where you walk in and it knows who you are. Bless you. It knows who you are because of your cell phone. So it says, hey, Nick just walked into the living room. Let's readjust the living room for him. And so the things that you see on the television are videos from the New York Times that you're interested in or that you've marked to read later, to watch later. There's customized Twitter feeds and news feeds and things that are kind of flowing around you. And it's really this hyper-personal experience that we built around that. And then we did a lot of data visualization of looking at data and users and trying to figure out what people were doing online and what they would be doing in the future with mobile devices. So while I was doing that, while I was living really in the future, I started doing talks, and that led to this book, which we're here talking about today.
And one of the stories that you tell at the very beginning, I think is very instructive for how we in the old media are seeing the emergence of new media. And essentially, I think you were at a conference, and a reporter from Wired decided to interview you.
Yep.
And you made the decision. He asked you, how you read the New York Times, and you basically said you weren't reading the paper.
Yeah.
Tell us how your bosses reacted to that.
Well, it was really funny because when I first started at the Times, and I tell this story in the introduction to the book, I remember the day that I found out that I could actually get the Sunday paper on Saturday. It was this amazing experience. I was like, I can get the Sunday paper a day early before everyone else. And because they start printing what they call it the Bulldog, and it's the version that is printed earlier because they have to print so many. So I would ride my bike every Saturday morning to the New York Times, and I would wait with the security guards for the first papers to show up, and I would run home, and friends started asking me to pick them up copies, so I was like running home with piles of papers. And all of a sudden I just stopped going. And I stopped reading the print paper. And what had happened is I started to replace it with a social experience. And I started to replace it with my phone and all these other experiences. And after a while, I ended up canceling my subscription. And I remember when I did it, I was in the newsroom, and it was like a lunchtime, and I kind of whispered under my breath as I called to cancel the paper, because I didn't know if it was somebody I knew that would hear me. And I was really kind of a little bit afraid of doing this. And so when the Wired reporter approached me at this conference, and he asked me, do you read the print paper? It was almost like time stood still. It was like that moment in The Matrix. And I was like, how do I answer this? And I was honest, and I said, no, but I read it on digital experiences and on my computer, on my laptop, on my e-reader. And so the article on Wired said, Nick Bilton loves the news, it's newspapers he can't stand. And which was a little bit editorialized, but when I got back to New York, my bosses went berserk, and they were like, you can't say you don't read the print paper, other people are going to cancel the print paper. And my response was, at first I was very apologetic for what I'd said. But
And tell us when this was.
this was a year ago. This was in February of last year, so it wasn't that long ago. But then after a while, I kept saying, well, if I'm not reading, I'm the next generation of consumer for the New York Times. If I'm not reading the print experience, maybe you should be asking what I'm doing instead, and we should be focusing on that. And so it was a big debate that I got into with certain people at the Times. And this was the minority. I mean, most people were very supportive, but there was a couple of people that kept trying to push this conversation of you can't say these things in public. And in the end, I mean, I think today it would be drastically different. I don't think anyone would say anything to me because they know that these changes are coming. But even just a year ago, it was a really big deal to talk about that.
Anyone who's read the book probably wants me to start where you start, with porn.
Porn.
But we'll get to that a little later, I promise. But I want to start instead where you address this issue of whether all this technology is dumbing us down. Mm-hmm. That it's distracting, it doesn't let us focus, and that long-term content, like books, like newspapers, will die. That's a fear that you hear a lot out there these days.
That's not what I say.
No,
Yes.
no, not at all.
Yeah.
And in fact, you counter that by saying that, hey, kids will play video games for 3 hours at a time. How is that not long-form content? But Nick, it's video games.
Yes. But video games are a narrative, right? I have this, there's a friend of mine who went to, well, first of all, for video games, there's a tremendous amount of research that I talk about in the book about how video games are actually really good for us.
You say doctors should be playing them.
Well, so surgeons that play video games, or laparoscopic surgeons that play video games, are actually about 60% faster and 40% more accurate than those that don't, right? And these are first-person shooter video games. These aren't just like Tetris and things like that. There's been studies with, more studies with first-person shooter video games recently that Daphne Bavelier in Rochester at the Brain Institute did, and they found that kids that play first-person shooter video games have the visual acuity of someone who's deaf, and that they have faster hand-eye coordination, they can be better at taking certain types of tests, the contrast ratio in their eyes is much better, and a long, long list of other things. Excuse me. And what these research shows is that video games are actually a really impressive narrative. And I think that what we kind of get caught up in is it's something we're not used to, and we become afraid of it. And there was a friend of mine who went to Europe this summer, and he said he took his son, and he was really excited that they were going to France, and they were going to Normandy, and he was going to tell him all about the war and what happened. And he did all this research, and he got all these books and everything. And they get to the beach, and his son's like, oh, this is where the British came over, and this is where the Germans were. And he described this entire thing. He kind of like acted it out. And he's like, how the hell do you know this? And he's like, oh, Call of Duty 2. Because it's all accurate. It's all. So my argument in the book is why do we all have to, in a history class, why do we all have to go in and open up this book and plod through this really kind of mundane experience? Why couldn't kids play a video game to learn about their history class? It doesn't mean that they don't read books for literature and other things, but for that experience, it may make more sense. So that's kind of something that I kind of look into a little bit.
Plodding through a history book.
But it's, I mean, who took history class and had this book that it was like, oh my God, I got to go to history class again, right? Why can't that be an immersive experience where you're involved in that world, and you actually, and you ask a German, hey, what happened on this day? Like, what was this battle like? And he explains in this kind of interactive experience. Oh, we came over there, and this happened here, and we won. Or, I mean, it doesn't mean that because it's not written in a book doesn't mean that it's not an immersive narrative. It actually is an immersive narrative, and the neuroscience around video games show that it can actually be really compelling for the brain too.
But what about this notion that you talk about in the book, a term that was coined by, I think, a former Apple and Microsoft executive, continuous partial attention?
Yes, by Linda Stone.
And the time suck that is Facebook and Twitter.
Yeah.
How does this advance us as a civilization?
I think that it advances us because, so there's a part in the book called Anchoring Communities, and I talk about Benedict Anderson. He's an anthropologist, and he wrote this unbelievable book in the 1980s called Imagine Communities. And the concept was that if I live in a country, I'm part of an imagined community. I'll never meet all the people that live in that country, right? But I feel a camaraderie towards them. If somebody walked up to me after and said, hey, I'm from Brooklyn, New York, I'd be like, hey, I'm from Brooklyn, New York too. And we kind of have this connection, right? But what's happened with the web is that because everything is so connected now, everything's an imagined community. There's nothing that separates us anymore. And so I think that what we're doing with these social networks is we're creating what I call anchoring communities, where we're saying there's this abyss that is the internet, and it's going to continue to grow at these unbelievable speeds. Let me pull people into this community that I can control, and then we can kind of go through the content together, and we can say, hey, this is a really great link you should read, or this is something that I found really fascinating, or check out this photo I took earlier. And I think that that's kind of what these social networks are doing. And originally, Twitter was designed to say, hey, I'm eating a hamburger on 34th Street. But now, people are, the majority of people are using it to share links and information and content the same way that we used to with editors and newspapers.
You tell some really great stories about the history of technological advance and how a lot of the fear and doubt that you're hearing now about Facebook and Twitter, even from my mouth, yeah. Has happened historically in many, many ways, from the printing press to the telephone to the phonograph, television. And people have what you call technochondria.
Yes.
Yeah. Technology hypochondria. And tell us a little bit about, I was particularly struck by what happened when trains came along. Yeah. That story will stick with me for a really long time. So tell us that and how that relates to what you hear now about the fears about technology.
When I first started writing the book and when I was doing research at the Times, I kept asking, I kept wondering, well, the internet's just another communication technology right now. We must have had fears when the telephone came out or television, and so I went back hundreds of years, and I found out that was the case. And with the printing press, there was tremendous fears, especially in Venetian society, where a lot of the stuff was taking place, that the printing press would kind of destroy society. That it would, there was a famous Venetian judge that said that the printing press, he actually used some pretty colorful language about it, but really said that we should continue to use pens for forever. And it went through all the way through society. When the train first came out, right, when the trains were first invented, there was people that said that if we traveled on a train over 20 miles an hour, that we would asphyxiate and die. There was a famous, a whole slew of really famous physicians and scientists that believed that if we hit 40 miles an hour on a train, that our bones would explode. And this was one technology after another that happened. And happened with the telephone. The front page article, March 22nd, 1876 on the New York Times, the telephone has been announced, and it describes what this technology is, but then the writer says that the telephone is going to empty concert halls and churches, and people will never leave their home again, right? It's the same thing we're hearing about the internet, right? People are going to use Twitter and Facebook, and they'll never leave their home again or have social interactions. And I think it's just another in the line of communications and technologies that we're a little bit afraid of, which is kind of understandable, but we should recognize that we've been here before.
At least in this iteration, is it fear or is it wistfulness? because you go out to a restaurant and you see a family, and their kids are sitting there texting or doing something on the phone.
Yeah.
And you look at that and you think, really? Is that what we're going to come to? Because that's not communication.
Well, it's not communication, but I think also, there's two answers to that. One is that we still haven't figured out where we are, right? This has all happened so quickly. The iPhone's only a few years old, right? And look how quickly that has changed society. And I think that we're still learning when not to use these things. So I think that's one part of it. But I also think that there's definitely a generational shift that's taking place. When I go out for dinner, I was out in San Francisco I think yesterday. I'm not even quite sure when it was at this point. But I was out for dinner and I met up with a bunch of tech bloggers that I know and tech writers. And there was 8 people at the table, and every single person had their phone out. And we were passing our phones around. We were saying, hey, check out this video clip I saw earlier. Hey, check out this comment on this blog post I wrote. And it was this augmented dinner, essentially, right? And we were completely engaged with each other, but we were using these devices to help kind of tell stories that we really wanted to share with each other. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I think if it's done in the right way. If I was sitting there texting somebody else, yeah, sure, that would be kind of rude and annoying. But I still think we're kind of learning how far we can take these things and when not to use them.
Just as an aside, you mentioned that you were with a bunch of other tech bloggers, and I noticed that you call yourself a blogger, not a columnist. What's the difference?
It's actually really funny you asked that. I wrote a piece. It was a roundup, I think, of comment. I sometimes do these roundups on the Times website where when there's like a new Apple product that comes out, I'll go and see what everyone has to say. Yeah. And I labeled a guy from, I think, The Guardian. I said, because he wrote a blog post about this new product, and I said, and so-and-so tech blogger for The Guardian wrote, and he wrote me this nasty note. He's like, I am not a tech blogger, I'm an editor. And I was like, whoa, okay, sorry. And I quickly changed it. And I don't differentiate between. I don't understand the difference. I think it's funny because the Times, my editor will sometimes be like, is this an article for the paper or is this a blog post? Huh. And I say, I don't know what's the difference, because I think that for me and for a lot of readers there is no difference. It's all just content, and it doesn't matter if it's words or video or photos or a blog post or a front page article. I think it's just the way we create and consume. Hmm.
Well, we've already established that I'm somewhat of a Luddite, but here's one aspect of social media that I'm pretty sure I will never, ever, ever take part in. Check with me in a couple months, though. And this is checking into places like Foursquare, using Facebook Places, where you are literally telling the world where you are and what you're doing. Yep. And not only that, you are allowing them to judge you for what you're doing and where you are. They can basically, you can invite people to give you a point for good or bad taste based on where you are, stuff like that. Yeah. What on earth is the point of that, and why am I afraid of it?
I'm not sure how to answer the second part of that question, but the first part, Foursquare and other services like that, I think are actually a sign of what the future holds a lot, because Foursquare is essentially a game, right? I check into places and I get badges and points, and I get to lead, and I get more points.
You get to be like the mayor or something like that.
You could be the mayor of somewhere. How many people here know about Foursquare? Okay, so for those of you that don't know about it, it's an application for your phone, and you can you check into somewhere. So if I go to, let's just say I went to a restaurant around the corner and I checked in, and I can leave a little comment, and I can say, hey, I can leave it for other people and say, hey, next time you're here, make sure you get the chicken sandwich on rye. It's really amazing. And I get points for that, right? And the more places I check in, I get these little badges that are on my phone, and it becomes almost like a game, right? So a couple of years ago, if I wanted to find out information about that restaurant, I would probably go to Zagat or Yelp or something like that. And now, because of the game aspect of it, I actually use this service more. And so you can actually see that it's like this gamification of everything. We're going back to the video game concept. The next generation, I think, is a gaming generation, and they want to apply these things to business, to the way they consume things, and also to how they share their location and places with their friends. I think that when I first started using these services, these location ones, I would check in everywhere, and now I don't. I check in sporadically, and I think that it's the same thing that's happened with other things in society. I jumped into it and I was like, okay, this is how much I need to do it, and this is how much I don't, and now I've stepped back quite a bit. So, but it is a fascinating experience.
But why are we all so willing to give up our privacy these days and tell the world where we are and what we're doing at all times? Are we so lonely that we can't help ourselves?
I mean, there's two answers to that. One is that we're social beings, right? We communicate, right? I live in New York. My nephew lives in LA. He knows how to open up. He's 4 years old. He knows how to open up my sister's laptop, click on the iChat logo, click on my face, and have a video chat with me without anyone being there. And is there anything wrong with that conversation? No, it's a social experience because I can't be there. And I think that what's happened is that we've kind of changed what we consider locations and time and space, and those have been kind of squashed a little bit with these kind of social experiences. And I think that's really it really shows that there's two ways to look at it. One is with the fear and trepidation that we'll never leave our home again and so on. And the other is that it's something that just connects the fabric of us together even more.
Jerome Lanier, who wrote a manifesto recently called "You Are Not a Gadget," and he basically comes out and says that Facebook reduces life to a database.
Mm-hmm.
And my take on that was, I remember a few months ago in the Los Angeles Times seeing an obituary of a young woman who had been in a car accident, bike accident, something like that. And the very last line of her obituary said, and she had several hundred friends on Facebook. And I thought to myself, how is that at all relevant? Are we really saying that the more friends you have on Facebook, that's a judgment on your life?
I mean, it is and it isn't. It's I mean, there's 500 million people on that service. It grows by half a million people a day, right? I mean, it's staggering to think of how quickly that this service has grown. And the information that you can gain from it is just mind-boggling, right? And the ability to share with hundreds or thousands of people simultaneously, I think is really compelling. But I don't think it's as much as it replaces one thing with another. I think it's this augmentation of our real lives that we get to kind of document where we are and what we're doing and who we're with, and share things with our friends that can't be there and our family, or that we've been with in that moment in time. And I think that one of the things, the misconceptions is that these things are going to replace real life, and I don't think that that's the case. I think it's just an additional pathway to how we actually communicate with people. I mean, just because I'm on Facebook and Twitter and Foursquare doesn't mean that I'm going to sit home and not leave my home. I'm still going to go out and about, and you see that happening with mobile devices. It's interesting. When I was researching the book, I found, so in the 1450s, before the printing press came out, the largest library in Europe had 122 books, right? Literally 122 books, and this had taken years to get to that point. And when the printing press came out, it started to grow, but it didn't change society instantly like we think that the printing press did. It wasn't until the 1500s, the early 1500s, when a gentleman by the name of Aldus Manutius invented the mobile book. It was this size, you could fold it up, stick it in your pocket. And before that, books were 50, 100 pounds a piece. Like, it took like 2 people to turn a page, right? You didn't take this thing to the park and go and relax for the weekend. Like, right. you went to a lectern in a church or a library and stood there. And the mobile book really changed everything because you could take it with you. And I think the same things happen with mobile phones today. For a long time, computers were the way that we accessed content, and we sat in our bedroom or our office and we didn't leave. And people don't want to do that. They want to be out. They want to be about. They want to be with other people. And these mobile devices that we all carry around, I think, have become essentially the mobile book of today.